When it comes to being out in the woods, hunters often get to experience things that a lot of other outdoor enthusiasts would never have the chance to encounter. It's not because they spend more time out of the woods, but rather how they spend that time. Hunters, they'll research and they'll learn their quarry's behaviors, then they'll go off into the woods, they'll sit incredibly still, incredibly silent for hours on end, and often they'll get to see animals doing things that a lot of people would never get the opportunity to see. However, every so often something will happen that they just absolutely could not have prepared for, and today's story is the perfect example of how a routine hunting trip could take an absolutely terrifying turn when the hunter becomes a hunted. But before we get into today's encounter, if you've had an encounter or know a story that you would like to have shared here on the show, please email me at the link below. If you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. If you haven't done so already, especially if you're a return viewer, please hit that subscribe button. While you're at it, grab your rattling antlers, throw them at the notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. 1 November morning in 1981, Douglas made the drive from Cleveland, Ohio, out to his friend's property out by Footville to go do a little bit of deer hunting. Douglas was a very experienced hunter. He grew up hunting. He did a lot of fowl hunting, going after geese and ducks, a lot of small game hunting as well, going after rabbits, squirrels, and pheasants, and he did a lot of big game hunting, mostly just deer and wild boar. Douglas was a pretty big guy. He was about 250 pounds. He worked as a correctional officer. So, needless to say, he was able to handle himself in the woods and handle himself on the street as well. And on this particular morning, he had only one thought on his mind, and that was to get a deer with his bow. His friend's property that he was going to be hunting on was a property he was very familiar with. He had hunted this property several times in the past, so he knew it pretty well. And he had seen some pretty big deer on this property, so needless to say, he was really looking forward to this hunt this day. So an hour after he left his house, he finally arrived at his friend's property. He pulled his vehicle over to the side, parked, got out, he grabbed all his gear, and then he started making his way into the woods. He made his way through the real thick woods, periodically having to move brush out of the way as he made his way deeper into them. He walked for about a half a mile till he arrived at the spot that he had planned to hunt. Once he got there, he kind of looked around, peering through the fog, trying to find the perfect spot to set up. Once he found that spot, he set up his gear and he settled in for the hunt. Now, this part of the property where he was hunting, it's very thick woods, thick brush, really tall trees, and there's a very narrow cut that goes right through the trees. And it's almost more like just a trail as opposed to a typical fence line. And directly behind him, there's an old creek bed that runs right through the property, and where he was set up was right on the edge of that creek bed. It was a spot that he had hunted before, a spot that he was very familiar with. So once he was settled in for the hunt, he just kind of sat there looking and peering into the bush, peering through the fog, looking down that cut, waiting for any sign of deer at all whatsoever. After he sat there for a little while, he started to realize that the area was incredibly quiet. Now, it's not abnormal when it's a thick fog for the area to be quiet because sound won't really travel through the thick fog too well. But he started to pick up that this silence was not just a normal thick foggy day silence. It was almost like a deafening silence. He could hear no wind because there was no wind. He heard no birds. He heard no small animals running through the brush. And he just kind of brushed that off, just more or less hyper-focused, looking down this cut and looking into the trees, waiting for deer. After sitting for a little while longer, all of a sudden he could hear something moving through the brush, and it sounded very large. So his first thought went to, this is a big deer coming. So he grabbed his bow, he got ready to draw it, and he was just staring into that cut. As he was listening to this thing move through the bush, he also started to pick up that its footfalls did not sound like a four-legged animal. it sounded more like it was bipedal. So he's standing there holding his bow, kind of trying to process everything he's hearing, wondering if he's actually hearing what he's hearing or if it's just his mind playing tricks on him. So as he's standing there holding his bow, listening to this thing move through the bush towards him, wondering what the hell is going on, he all of a sudden notices in the brush through the thick fog, he can see this massive, dark, shadowy figure moving through the brush towards that cut. At this point, he was still thinking that this is a deer moving through the bush, so he has his bow ready when all of a sudden from in the brush out steps this absolutely massive creature. It's about 8 feet tall, has really broad shoulders with pretty much no neck. It just went basically shoulders to head. It had long, muscular arms. Its face looked very human-like, but almost more sunken in. It had dark eyes, and this creature was looking directly at him. And it was almost like this creature, as he's looking at it, in just absolute disbelief of what he's looking at, it was like this creature as well just basically went into shock. It opened its mouth almost like it was surprised to see him, and he could just see these massive flat teeth, and this creature moved its mouth almost like in a grimace. It turned and it almost like dove back into the bush. At this point, Douglas is absolutely terrified. He feels like throwing up in this moment. He's so scared. And remember, this guy was a tough guy. He was a correctional officer. While he was a correctional officer, he saw numerous murders in the jail. So he was used to seeing things that a lot of people normally don't have to deal with. He was a very tough guy. But in this moment, because of what he just saw, he was absolutely terrified. He went to take a couple of steps backwards and he ended up falling down into that creek. And as he fell, he ended up twisting his knee and he dropped his bow into the water as well. So now he's inside the creek. He's sitting there. He's in absolute pain because of his knee. He's still absolutely terrified, but he knows that he has to do something. He needs to get out of this creek and get back to his vehicle. So he starts climbing up the edge of the creek bed. He left his bow lying down in the water. Once he got up to the top, he stood up as best he could, trying to favor his one leg because his knee was just absolutely throbbing. He starts looking around for any sign of this creature whatsoever. He didn't see it, so he starts making his way back towards his vehicle, but every step he was taking was just absolute agony because of his knee. So as he's making his way through the bush, all of a sudden he could hear this creature moving through the brush behind him as well. At this point, he's even more terrified than he was before. His heart's just racing because he knows this thing is coming after him, and there's really nothing he could do. He can't go any faster, and if this thing attacks him, he really can't defend himself. It's much bigger than him, a lot stronger than him. It's moving through the bush with absolute ease, and he's stuck basically hobbling along through the brush, taking more branches in the face, getting all cut up. At this point, he could hear this thing getting closer up behind him when all of a sudden it starts letting out these real deep guttural, almost like guttural growls at him. And every time it would growl, it just struck even more fear into him, but there was really nothing he could do. He just kept going through the bush as fast as he could back towards his vehicle. The entire time on his way back to the vehicle, this thing stayed just behind him, and he knew that it could have got him whenever it wanted. Eventually, though, he did make it back to his vehicle. He got in, and he just floored it all the way home. He's had several more opportunities and invites out to this property to go hunting, but he's never been back. He always made an excuse not to go. While this creature's description very closely does match that of Sasquatch with the size, the muscular build, the long hair, Douglas believes that what he encountered that day out in the woods was more along the lines of being like a Neanderthal type man, basically because of the size and the sunken in face and the teeth structure on this thing. Well, that's it for today's encounter. I'd really like to know your thoughts on this one. Do you think that Douglas encountered a Sasquatch, or do you think it was a Neanderthal man like Douglas believes? But as always, thanks for joining us. If you haven't done so already, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.